Jedediah Coulter tracked the lone mule through the amber afternoon light, its bell a faint, sad chime. The tracks led into Broken Ridge territory, a maze of canyons where a man could lose his way as easily as the sun. A cold front was moving in from the north, its breath already sharp in the high pines. The mule was clearly exhausted, and so was his own horse, Daisy. If he did not find the animal and its owner before the first snow, the mountain would claim them both. He moved with a quiet patience learned from years of solitude. Daisy, his buckskin mare, stepped carefully over the rocky ground, her trust in him absolute. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a promise of the coming weather. Jed preferred the company of the mountains to that of men, but he could not ignore a creature in distress, or the person who surely depended on it. The mule's harness was good leather, but cracked from sun and neglect, suggesting a recent hardship. After another hour he saw it, huddled in a small clearing near a stream, its head low. It did not run as he approached. It simply watched him with tired, liquid brown eyes. Jed dismounted, speaking in a low, calm voice, as he offered a piece of dried apple from his satchel. The mule took it with a soft muzzle, a gesture of surrender. He checked the animal for injuries, finding only deep exhaustion and a few scrapes. Then he turned his attention to the packs. Inside one canvas pack were standard supplies: flour, salt, coffee, and a small sack of beans. But the other pack held something different. Tucked beside a worn wool blanket was a small carved wooden bird, smoothed by the touch of small hands. Beneath it, a ledger book and a half-written letter on creased paper. Jed carefully unfolded the letter. It was not a call for help. It was a letter of farewell, written in a neat, steady hand to someone named Sarah back east. The words spoke of a dream that had soured, of a valley that had grown cold, and of a decision to move on before winter trapped them for good. The letter was signed by a woman named Alara. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. This was not the story of an accident. It was the story of someone giving up. He now held a responsibility that felt heavier than the mule's pack. The coming storm was no longer just a challenge, but a deadline for a stranger's hope. Jed tied the mule's lead to his saddle horn and began to backtrack, his eyes scanning the ground for the trail of the person who had set the animal loose. The tracks were faint, a woman's boot print and a much smaller one beside it, a child. They were heading down from the high country, away from the established claims, moving toward the impassable eastern bluffs. An odd choice of direction if you knew the land. It suggested they were lost or perhaps avoiding the main trail for a reason. The wind picked up, whispering through the aspens, their golden leaves shivering like coins. The sun dipped lower, painting the undersides of the clouds a bruised purple. He needed to find them before dark, before the temperature dropped completely. He pushed Daisy into a steady trot, the mule following reluctantly behind. He found their camp just as dusk settled into the valley. It was a pitiful sight. A small wagon with a broken axle sat tilted at a sad angle. A fire pit held cold ashes, and a few meager belongings were scattered nearby, as if packed in a great hurry. There was no sign of Alara or her child. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept down Jed's spine. He dismounted and examined the wagon. The axle was thick oak, hard to break. He ran his calloused fingers along the splintered wood. It was a clean break, but something about it felt wrong. Near the center of the fracture, he found it. A fine, straight line, almost invisible, where a saw had cut nearly halfway through the wood. The rest had splintered under the wagon's weight. This was no accident. It was sabotage. He called out, his voice carrying in the still, cold air. "Hello, the camp. I found your mule." Silence answered him. He called again, this time adding, "I mean no harm. The snow is coming." He waited, listening. A faint sound, a child's cough, came from a thicket of willows near the creek. He walked slowly toward the sound, his hands open and away from his sides to show he was not a threat. A woman emerged from the shadows, holding a small boy close to her. She was younger than he expected, with tired eyes the color of the evening sky. She held a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. The boy, who couldn't be more than 5, peeked out from behind her legs, his face smudged with dirt. The carved wooden bird he found was clutched in the boy's small hand. Her relief at seeing the mule was quickly replaced by suspicion of the man who had brought it. The land deed has a specific clause about continuous habitation, a detail he would learn later. Jed just stood there, letting her measure him in the fading light. He had brought her property back, but in doing so, he had walked into a problem much deeper than a broken axle. He kept his voice low and even, the way he would with a spooked horse. "My name is Jedediah Coulter. My cabin is about 5 miles west of here. You can't stay here tonight. The temperature will drop well below freezing." The woman, Alara, did not lower the skillet. Her gaze flickered from his face to the broken axle and back again. She knew it had been cut. She had probably discovered it herself, and that knowledge had turned her desperation into fear. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy but firm. "I told you, Jed Coulter. I live here," he replied simply, "and you just happened to find my mule." "It's a small valley," he said, not untruthfully, "and a mule's bell carries a long way. I saw the cut on your axle. That's a bad piece of luck." He watched her face, saw the conflict in her eyes. Trusting a stranger was a risk, but staying here with a child and a winter storm brewing was a certainty of disaster. The boy, Samuel, coughed again, a dry, racking sound. That decided it for her. She slowly lowered the heavy skillet. "The axle broke this morning. We were trying to get to the pass before the snow." She did not mention who she thought had cut it. Some dangers did not need to be named. "The pass will be closed by morning," Jed stated plainly. "You and the boy can take my horse. I'll lead the mule and carry your things." It was a practical solution, and the offer of his own horse was a clear sign of his good intentions. They packed her few belongings in silence, the only sounds the rustle of canvas and the rising wind. He loaded her sacks onto the mule, working with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. He helped her onto Daisy's saddle, then lifted the boy to sit in front of her, wrapping them both in the worn wool blanket from her pack. Samuel looked at him with wide, curious eyes. Jed offered the boy a small, reassuring smile. They began the slow journey to his cabin, a strange little caravan under a sky full of stars that were quickly being swallowed by clouds. The trail was dark, but he knew every rock and root by heart. As they walked, fat, wet snowflakes began to fall, melting on their shoulders. His cabin was small but sturdy, built of hand-hewn logs with a stone fireplace that was the heart of the home. The single room was neat and spare. A bed in one corner, a table with one chair, and shelves filled with books and preserved goods. The moment they stepped inside, the warmth from the embers in the hearth enveloped them. Alara slid from the horse, her body stiff with cold, and helped her son down. Samuel stared at the glowing coals with wonder. Jed moved without fuss, adding wood to the fire until it roared to life, pushing the deep chill from the room. He put a kettle of water on to boil and pulled the single chair to the fire for Alara. "Sit," he said. It was not a command, but a gentle suggestion. She sank into the chair, exhaustion etched on her face. He prepared a simple meal of stew and cornbread, moving around the small space with a quiet competence. They ate at the table, Jed sitting on a wooden stool he brought from the corner. Samuel, warmed and fed, fell asleep in his mother's lap. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow began to fall in earnest. The small cabin felt like a fortress against the storm. It was clear this woman and child could not have survived the night on their own. That simple fact created a bond between them, woven from necessity and the shared warmth of the fire. He had brought them out of the storm, but the trouble that broke their axle was still out there in the dark. Alara spoke after a long silence, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Jed simply nodded, watching the flames. He was not a man for many words. He gave her and the boy his bed, taking a blanket for himself on the floor by the fire. He did not ask about the saw mark on her axle, nor did she volunteer any more information. The questions could wait until morning, until the storm had passed and the immediate danger was over. For now, it was enough to be safe and warm. As he drifted to sleep, he could hear the steady breathing of the woman and child, a foreign but not unwelcome sound in his solitary home. He knew their presence would change things. The quiet order of his life had been broken, just like the axle on her wagon. The next morning, the world was white and silent. Snow had piled high against the door and covered the windows, sealing them in. Jed cooked breakfast while Alara watched, her initial wariness softening into a quiet observation. She saw the way his hands, though rough, were gentle as he handled a cast-iron pan. She saw the worn book on the small shelf next to his bed. It was a collection of poems, an unexpected thing in a mountain man's cabin. Samuel, rested and warm, was a different child. He chattered happily and explored the small cabin, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. He found the small wooden bird Jed had placed on the mantelpiece and showed it to his mother with a proud smile. "My husband carved that," Alara said softly, her eyes on the fire. "He was a good man. He believed in this valley. He said the soil was rich and the water was clean." She paused. "He died last spring, a logging accident." Jed listened without interrupting. He knew how loss could hollow out a person, leaving an empty space where a future used to be. The trading post ledger shows 3 names from last winter, all marked as leaving the valley before their claims were proven. Jed had seen it himself. Men and their families would arrive full of hope, only to be gone within a season, their land sold for a fraction of its worth. "We were doing all right," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, "until the company man came. Mr. Blackwood." She said the name as if it tasted foul. "He works for the timber company that bought up the old mill. He came around a month ago. He said my claim wasn't valid." Jed turned from the stove, his full attention on her now. "How could it not be valid? You have the deed." "He said my husband filed it incorrectly, that there was a clause about improving the land, and since my husband passed, the improvements had stopped. He offered me $100 for the 80 acres in the cabin. $100 was an insult, barely enough to get her and the boy back east. It was a common tactic, using legal words to twist the truth and prey on those who were isolated and vulnerable. Jed had heard similar stories from other homesteaders who had given up and left. In the quiet of the mountains, some things speak louder than words. He finally understood the half-sawn axle. It was not just meant to stop her, it was meant to terrify her into accepting the offer. The snow kept them inside for 2 full days. In that time, a fragile routine formed. Jed would tend the fire and see to the animals in the lean-to he had built against the cabin. Alara would cook and mend their clothes. Samuel, with a child's resilience, seemed to think it was all a grand adventure. He followed Jed everywhere, asking endless questions about the animal tracks in the snow and the names of the tools hanging on the wall. Jed, to his own surprise, found he did not mind. The boy's bright curiosity was a welcome change from the long silence he was used to. He even found himself carving a small wooden horse for the boy, his whittling knife moving with a long-forgotten skill. Alara told him more about Silas Blackwood. He was a smooth talker, always polite, but with an unsettling coldness in his eyes. He had visited every homesteader in the valley, making similar offers, pointing out small, supposed flaws in their paperwork. The crate Jed helped unload at the trading post last month bore a mine mark that matches the seal on Blackwood's letters. It was a new company, powerful and well-funded, and they clearly wanted the entire valley for themselves. Ilara's land was particularly valuable because it had the only year-round spring on the north slope. With control of that spring, the company could control everything downstream. On the 3rd morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The snow shone so brightly it hurt the eyes. "I have to go back," Alara said, standing by the door and looking out at the transformed landscape. "My deed papers are in a lockbox under the floor of my cabin. Without them, I have no proof against Blackwood." Jed nodded slowly. He knew she was right, but he also knew that whoever sawed her axle would not be happy to see her return. "It's too dangerous for you and the boy to go alone," he said. "I'll take you." The decision was made without any further discussion. He was involved now, whether he liked it or not. He had offered her shelter from a storm, and in doing so, had stepped into the path of a much more dangerous one. They traveled on snowshoes Jed had made from ash wood and rawhide, leaving Daisy and the mule in the relative warmth of the lean-to. The journey was slow and arduous, the deep snow making every step a struggle. Jed broke the trail, his powerful legs pushing through the drifts, while Alara and Samuel followed in the path he made. Samuel rode on Jed's shoulders for much of the way, his small legs no match for the deep powder. The silence of the snow-covered forest was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of their snowshoes and the sound of their own breathing. It was a beautiful and unforgiving world. They reached her homestead in the late afternoon. The small cabin stood half-buried in a drift, looking forlorn and abandoned. A set of fresh tracks led from the woods to the front door and back again. Someone had been there since the storm. Jed put a hand on Alara's arm, stopping her. He unslung the rifle he carried on his back. "Wait here with the boy," he whispered, his eyes scanning the trees. "Stay out of sight." He moved toward the cabin with the quiet grace of a predator, rifle held at the ready. He circled the small structure, checking for any sign of ambush. The tracks belonged to a single man wearing heavy boots. They led to the door, which was slightly ajar and then away, back into the forest. He signaled for her to come, and they entered the cabin together. The inside was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, sacks of flour and sugar were split open on the floor, and drawers were pulled out and emptied. Whoever was here had been looking for something. Alara gave a small cry of despair. She ran to the back corner of the room where a loose floorboard hid her small metal lockbox. The board had been pried up. The box was gone. All her hope, her one piece of proof, had been stolen. She sank to the floor, the fight finally draining out of her. Jed's jaw tightened. Blackwood had not waited. He had used the storm as cover to steal the one thing that could stop him. This was no longer just about legal tricks. It had escalated to theft. He knelt beside her, not offering empty words of comfort. He simply waited for the first wave of her despair to pass. The stolen box changed everything, making their fight immensely harder. After a few minutes, Alara looked up, her eyes blazing with a new fire. It was the anger of a person with nothing left to lose. "He won't win," she said, her voice low and fierce. Jed looked around the ransacked room. The man had been thorough, but also hasty. A small, official-looking envelope lay half-hidden under the overturned bed mattress. Jed picked it up. It was a tax notice from the territorial office, addressed to her late husband. The land deed carries an old stamp, the same one visible on this tax receipt. It was not the deed itself, but it was official correspondence, linking her husband's name to this specific plot of land, dated just 3 months ago. It directly contradicted Blackwood's claim that the property had been abandoned or unimproved for a long period. "It's not the deed," Jed said, handing it to her, "but it's a start." A small flicker of hope returned to her face. It was a tiny victory, a small weapon in a large fight, but it was something. They could not stay. The man who stole the box could return. Jed helped her gather a few personal items the thief had overlooked, a photograph of her husband, a small book of her mother's recipes. He righted the furniture and did his best to clean up the spilled flour, a simple act of restoring order in the midst of chaos. He found a small bag of her son's marbles, which he quietly slipped into his own pocket to give to the boy later. They made the long trek back to his cabin, arriving well after dark, their bodies aching with fatigue. Samuel was asleep on his shoulders again. That night, sitting by the fire, a new understanding passed between them. They were no longer a stranger and a woman in need. They were partners, united against a common enemy. "There are other homesteaders," Jed said, thinking aloud. "The Millers, the Jensens. Blackwood has been to see them too. Alone we are easy targets. Together we might have a chance." Alara looked at him, a question in her eyes. Jed was a man who had chosen solitude. Now he was talking about bringing people together. The quiet of the mountains had been his shield for a long time. He was proposing to lay down that shield, not just for her, but for all of them. For a valley he had come to quietly call his home. The next day, Jed left Alara and Samuel at the cabin and set out for the trading post. It was the central hub of their small, scattered community, a place of commerce and news run by a crusty old man named Finn. The journey was easier now that the trail had been broken. The sun was bright on the snow, and the air was crisp and clean. When he arrived, the post was quiet. Finn was behind the counter, polishing a pair of spectacles. He was a man who saw and heard everything in the valley, and he trusted Jed. "Coulter," he grunted by way of greeting, "thought that storm might have buried you." "It almost buried someone else," Jed said, and he told Finn the whole story. Finn listened intently, his weathered face growing grim. When Jed was finished, the old man pushed his spectacles up on his forehead and rubbed his eyes. "Silas Blackwood," he said, the name leaving a sour taste. "He comes in here, pays in company script, talks about progress and bringing prosperity to the valley. But I've seen his kind before. They promise a railroad and leave you with nothing but stumps." Finn opened a large, dusty ledger on the counter. The trading post ledger shows 3 names from last winter, families Jed knew had left. Finn pointed a gnarled finger at the entries. The Hansons, the O'Briens, the Smiths, all of them had dealings with Blackwood. All of them sold their claims to his company for pennies and left before their first winter was over. He told them the same stories, about faulty paperwork and the coming hard winter. This was the proof Jed needed, a pattern of behavior. Did they say anything to you before they left, Finn? They were scared, Finn admitted. O'Brien told me his prize bull just turned up dead one morning. No marks on it. The Smiths had a small fire in their barn, lost all their seed for the spring planting. Blackwood was there the next day, offering his condolences and a way out. These were not accidents. They were calculated acts of intimidation designed to break a homesteader's spirit. The community itself was under attack, picked apart one family at a time. Anyone could feel the chill of a lonely winter approaching. Jed felt a slow anger building inside him. He had come to these mountains to be left alone, but Blackwood was poisoning the well for everyone. We need to warn the others, Jed said. The Millers and the Jensens are still holding on. They're stubborn, Finn agreed, but Blackwood is patient. He'll find a way to break them too. As Jed was about to leave, Finn stopped him. There's one more thing, he said, lowering his voice. The territorial surveyor was supposed to come through last month to re-verify the original claim markers. He never showed. Blackwood told everyone the man was delayed by weather back east. I got a letter from my cousin in the capital. The surveyor, a man named Peters, left for this valley 2 months ago. He was never heard from again. The implication was heavy and unspoken. A missing official was far more serious than intimidation. It meant Blackwood was willing to go to extreme lengths to get what he wanted. Jed left the trading post with a new sense of urgency. He was not just fighting for Alara's land anymore. He was fighting for the soul of the entire valley. Jed visited the Jensen farm first. It was a modest claim nestled in a south-facing hollow, perfect for avoiding the worst of the winter winds. Lars Jensen was a big, quiet man with hands the size of shovels. His wife Maria was small but radiated a strength that matched her husband's. They had 2 young daughters. Jed found Lars in his barn, mending a harness. He listened to Jed's story without expression, but Jed could see the tension in his shoulders. When he finished, Lars simply nodded. Blackwood was here last week, Lars said, his voice a low rumble. Told me the creek was going to be diverted for logging operations upstream. Said my water rights wouldn't be worth the paper they were written on by next summer. The crate from the new company at the trading post bore a mark that matched the seal on the official-looking papers Blackwood had shown him. He offered to buy you out, Jed guessed. A generous offer, he called it, Lars scoffed. Enough to get us to the next territory, maybe. Maria came into the barn, wiping her hands on her apron. She had clearly been listening. We told him no, she said, her voice firm. This land is our future. We are not running. Jed told them about the stolen deed box and the missing surveyor. Maria's face paled. This was more than just business pressure. What do you propose we do, Coulter? Lars asked, his eyes meeting Jed's. For now, we watch each other's backs, Jed said. If you see anyone near your property that doesn't belong, you send word. We can't let him pick us off one by one. He went to the Millers next, whose claim bordered Alara's. They were an older couple, and their resolve was already wavering. Their well had gone brackish a month ago, and Blackwood had told them it was a natural shift in the water table, a sign the land was failing. But Jed, after a quick inspection, found something else. A pile of rocks and earth, cleverly disguised with brush, that diverted a small, dirty runoff stream directly toward their wellhead. It was another act of sabotage, subtle and cruel. He showed them how to clear the blockage and rewrote the runoff. The gratitude in their eyes was mixed with a new fear. They now understood the nature of the man they were dealing with. As he rode home, the sun was setting, casting long blue shadows across the snow. He had planted seeds of unity, but he knew they would need more than just shared suspicion to stand against Blackwood. They needed proof that would hold up with the law. The missing surveyor, Peters, was the key. If Jed could find out what happened to him, he could expose Blackwood for the criminal he was. He arrived back at his cabin to the smell of roasting venison and the sight of smoke curling from his chimney. For the first time in years, coming home felt like an arrival, not just a return to an empty shelter. Ilara and Samuel were waiting. That night, Jed looked over his old surveying maps of the territory. He had worked for the railroad briefly before settling here, and he still had his tools and records. He compared them to a copy of the original valley survey he had gotten from Finn. He found a discrepancy, a small one, but significant. The official markers for the northern section of the valley, where the logging company was planning its operations, seemed to be off by several hundred yards on the new company maps Blackwood had been showing people. The land grant that Alara held had a clause about continuous habitation, and it also specified boundaries based on natural landmarks, a large granite outcrop, and an old-growth pine. According to Blackwood's map, those landmarks were now outside her property line. "He's not just trying to scare people off their land," Jed said, tracing the lines on the map with his finger. "He's trying to steal it on paper too." Alara looked over his shoulder. "He's moving the boundaries." "Exactly. If he can get the old claims invalidated, he can file a new survey with the territorial office, one that gives his company control of all the best timber and water. No one would be the wiser. But to file a new survey, he would need the territorial surveyor to sign off on it, or he would need the surveyor to disappear, so a new, more compliant one could be appointed. The fate of the missing man, Peters, suddenly seemed much more certain and much more sinister. Jed knew where he had to look. The area where the survey markers had been supposedly moved was a remote and rugged stretch of land along the valley's northern ridge. It was not a place one would go by accident. The next morning, he prepared for a long journey. He packed supplies for 3 days, his old surveyor's transit, and his rifle. Alara insisted on packing him food, her movements efficient and her face etched with worry. "Be careful, Jedediah," she said, using his full name for the first time. It felt strangely intimate. He just nodded, but his eyes met hers for a moment longer than necessary. Samuel ran to him as he was about to leave, pressing the small wooden horse Jed had carved for him back into his hand. "For luck," the boy said seriously. Jed knelt down and looked the boy in the eye. "I'll bring it back," he promised. It was a promise to both the child and his mother. He was no longer just a man trying to be left alone. He was a man with something to protect. A woman, a child, and a valley full of people who were counting on him. The trek to the northern ridge was cold and demanding. Jed moved through the dense forest, the only sounds the crunch of his snowshoes and the call of a distant raven. The air was thin and sharp at this elevation. He made camp the first night in a sheltered overhang of rock, building a small, smokeless fire that provided more comfort than heat. He thought about the cabin, about the warmth and the unfamiliar sounds of other people breathing in the quiet dark. The solitude he had once cherished now felt like a hollow ache. He missed them. The realization was as sharp and clear as the stars overhead. On the second day, he reached the area where the survey markers were supposed to be. He found the first one, an old iron stake driven into the ground, exactly where his own map said it should be. But when he searched for the second marker, the one that defined the eastern boundary of the valley's main watershed, he found nothing but a hole in the ground filled with snow. The stake was gone. He searched the area and found drag marks, faint but undeniable, leading deeper into a ravine. He followed them, his hand resting on his rifle. The ravine was steep and choked with deadfall, and at the bottom of it, half buried under a recent rock slide, he saw a flash of canvas. It was a surveyor's bag. He scrambled down the loose rock, his heart pounding. The bag was wedged under a large boulder. Inside, he found a broken transit, a set of waterlogged notes, and a leather wallet. The wallet held the papers of a man named Thomas Peters, the missing territorial surveyor. Jed felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. The rock slide that buried the rest of the ravine was too precise, too contained. This was not the work of the mountain. It was a shallow, hurried grave. Blackwood had not just scared a man off. He had silenced him. Jed took the wallet and the waterlogged journal from the bag. The journal was mostly ruined, but a few pages at the back were protected by an oilskin flap. The ink was faded but legible. Peters had documented his meetings with Blackwood. He wrote of offers turning to thinly veiled threats. He noted the discrepancies in the old survey markers and Blackwood's new, fraudulent maps. The final entry was chillingly simple. It named a time and a place for a final meeting with Blackwood, high on the northern ridge, to discuss a last generous offer. It was dated the day before the first snows of the season, nearly a month ago. He had the truth. It was not a body, but it was the man's own words. He carefully placed the wallet and the journal inside his own coat, protecting them from the elements. As he climbed from the ravine, a twig snapped in the woods to his right. It was a small sound, but in the profound silence of the high country, it was as loud as a gunshot. He froze, melting back into the shadow of a large fir tree. He did not reach for his rifle. He simply listened, his senses expanding into the cold air. He heard nothing more, but he could feel it. He was being watched. Blackwood had not set an ambush here. That was not his style. An open fight was unpredictable. Instead, he had let Jed find what he was looking for, and now the hunt would begin. A quiet, patient hunt on the long trail home. Jed was the loose end now. He and the evidence he carried had to disappear. He thought of Ilara and Samuel waiting in the warmth of the cabin. That thought was not a weakness. It was a fire in the cold hollow of his fear. It was a reason to be smarter, to be faster, to survive. He did not take the direct route back. He cut east, moving through the thickest parts of the forest, using every bit of his knowledge to hide his trail. He walked on rock ledges where he could, crossed streams to wash away his scent, and backtracked twice, waiting in absolute stillness for long minutes, listening for the sound of pursuit. The second time, he heard it, the soft crunch of a snowshoe far behind him, but gaining. There was more than one. They were skilled, but they did not know this part of the mountain the way he did. This was his home. He was the ghost here, not them. He traveled through the night, the moon a cold silver dish in a sky full of stars. He did not light a fire. He ate jerked venison from his pocket and melted snow in his mouth for water. Fatigue was a heavy cloak on his shoulders, but the thought of the cabin, of the light in the window, drove him forward. He was not just running for his own life. He was carrying the future of the entire valley in his coat pocket. He saw his own smoke before he saw the cabin, a thin gray ribbon rising into the pale morning air. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He stopped in the tree line, watching the small building for a long time. It looked peaceful, safe, but he knew it was the most dangerous place he could be. Blackwood would expect him to go there. He would not come with guns blazing. He would come with a story, with a lie big enough to cover a murder. Jed circled wide, approaching the cabin from the rear, from the cover of the aspens. He gave a low whistle, the call of a mountain quail, a signal he and Ilara had agreed upon. A moment later, she appeared at the back door, a basket of laundry in her hands, her face a mask of casual industry. But her eyes scanned the woods, and when they met his, a flicker of understanding passed between them. He gave a slight shake of his head, a warning. She nodded almost imperceptibly and went back inside. She knew. She would be ready. He did not go in. He found a place among the rocks above the cabin, a position that gave him a clear view of the front trail and the door. He settled in to wait. The cold was a living thing, seeping into his bones, but he ignored it. He was a part of the mountain now, a silent, patient observer. 2 hours later they came. Silas Blackwood rode in front, his posture relaxed as if he were paying a social call. Behind him were 2 other men, strangers, their faces hard and watchful. One of them wore a tarnished badge on his coat. A bought man, Jed thought. Not real law. Blackwood dismounted and knocked on the door. Jed watched, his rifle resting on the rock in front of him, the sight trained on Blackwood's chest. He could end it right now. One clean shot. But that would only trade one crime for another. It would leave a stain on everything that came after. Ilara answered the door, Samuel hiding behind her skirts. She looked worried, but not terrified. Mrs. Hale, Blackwood said, his voice smooth and full of false concern. I apologize for the intrusion. We're looking for Jedediah Coulter. He is not here, Ilara said, her voice steady. He went hunting several days ago. I see, Blackwood said, his eyes flicking around, taking in the small signs of Jed's presence. Well, I'm afraid I have some bad news. The territorial surveyor, Mr. Peters, has gone missing. We found his camp abandoned, and we found Mr. Coulter's tracks all around it. This man, he gestured to the man with the badge, is a deputy marshal. We just have a few questions for Mr. Coulter about what he might have seen. It was a clever lie. It painted Jed as a person of interest, a suspicious loner involved in a disappearance. It was designed to isolate him, to turn his chosen solitude into a weapon against him. Jed watched Alara's face. He saw her chin lift. "Mr. Coulter is an honorable man," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that startled even Jed. "He helps his neighbors. He saved my son and me from the storm. If you have questions for him, you can ask them when he returns." Blackwood's smile tightened. He had not expected such a firm defense. "Of course, ma'am. We'll just wait, if you don't mind." He and his men settled in, making a small fire, their presence a silent occupation of the small clearing. They were not leaving. They were laying a siege. The sun began to dip toward the peaks. The waiting was a form of torture. Jed knew he could not stay on the ridge forever. He had to act. But how? Just as despair began to touch the edges of his mind, he saw movement on the western trail. It was Lars Jensen, leading an ox. Behind him was Mr. Miller, his wife beside him in their small wagon. They were moving slowly, deliberately, not like people in a hurry, but like people arriving for a purpose. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing, their presence changing the dynamic completely. Blackwood's men shifted uneasily. This was no longer about one woman and a missing man. Blackwood walked toward them, his smile gone, replaced by a mask of authority. "There's no business for you here, Jensen. Turn around and go home." Lars Jensen looked at Blackwood, then at the cabin, then back at Blackwood. His face was like carved granite. "We heard Mrs. Hale had visitors," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We thought we'd be neighborly." At that moment, Jed made his move. He did not come from the rocks above, where they might expect him. He came from the aspens to the side, walking into the clearing with his rifle held loosely in his hands, pointed at the ground. He moved without hurry, his eyes locked on Blackwood. Every man in the clearing turned to look at him. The fake deputy's hand went to his pistol. "I heard you were looking for me," Jed said, his voice calm. Blackwood recovered quickly, a smug look returning to his face. He had him now. "Coulter, we need you to answer for the disappearance of Thomas Peters." "I can do more than that," Jed said. He pulled the oilskin-wrapped journal from his coat and tossed it onto the snow-covered ground between them. "I can let him speak for himself. That's his journal. It tells of your threats. It names the time and place of your final meeting." Blackwood paled. He had searched the camp, but he had not found the journal. It was the one piece of evidence he had missed. "That proves nothing," he blustered. "A book of lies." "And what about this?" Alara said, stepping out onto the porch. She held up the tax notice Jed had found in her ransacked cabin. "This is a territorial tax receipt for this land, paid by my husband less than 6 months ago. Yet you told me my claim was invalid because it had been abandoned for nearly a year. You are a liar, Mr. Blackwood." Mr. Miller stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "And you told me my well went bad because the mountain was drying up. But Mr. Coulter found where you diverted a runoff stream to poison it." Lars Jensen took another step, his shadow falling over Blackwood. "You told me my water rights would be worthless. You tried to scare me off my own land." The accusations hung in the cold, still air. Blackwood was surrounded, not by guns, but by the truth. His lies were unraveling one by one. The fake deputy looked from the homesteaders to Blackwood, his confidence evaporating. This was not the simple arrest of a lone man he had been paid for. "This is nonsense," Blackwood snarled, reaching for the pistol at his belt. He never cleared the holster. Jed's rifle was up in a single fluid motion, the hammer cocked. But Jed did not fire. He did not need to. From the main trail behind the Jensens and Millers, another rider appeared. This man was older, with a weathered face and tired eyes, and the badge on his coat was worn and authentic. Marshal Elias Vance had finally arrived, drawn by a message Finn had sent with a traveling fur trapper 2 days ago. The marshal took in the scene with a practiced eye. The armed men, the defiant homesteaders, and Jedediah Coulter, standing like a statue in the center of it all. "Silas Blackwood," Marshal Vance said, his voice carrying the weight of undisputed law. "I think you have a great deal to answer for." The fight was over. There had been no avalanche, no final, bloody shootout. The victory had been won with courage, with community, and with the quiet, stubborn truth. It had been won by people who had nothing left to lose, and so had found the strength to stand together. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing for the valley. Marshal Vance's investigation was thorough. Armed with Peter's journal and the testimony of the homesteaders, he uncovered the full extent of Blackwood's crimes. They found the surveyor's body in the ravine, just as the journal's last entry had suggested. The company's charter was exposed as a fraudulent enterprise, its assets seized by the territory. The valley was finally truly safe. Jedediah Coulter found that the solitude he had once craved no longer called to him. The silence of his cabin felt empty now, not peaceful. He spent his days helping, moving between the homesteads. He worked with Lars Jensen to clear a new field for planting. He helped the Millers shore up the foundation of their home. He became the quiet, steady center of the community he had unwittingly brought together. Most of his time, however, was spent at Alara's claim. They worked together, rebuilding what had been broken. They repaired the wagon, mended the fences, and planted a garden in the rich soil behind the cabin as the last of the snow melted away. They did not speak of the future or of what lay between them. They did not have to. It was there in the easy silence as they worked, in the shared meals at the end of the day, in the way Samuel would run to him, taking his hand without hesitation. One evening in late spring, they sat on the small porch of her cabin, watching the last light of the sun paint the high peaks in shades of purple and rose. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and new leaves. Samuel was inside, asleep, the small wooden horse Jed had carved for him on the blanket beside him. "You never went back," Alara said softly, her voice just above a whisper. "To your cabin." Jed looked out at the valley, at the lights that were beginning to glow in the windows of the Jensen and Miller homes. He thought of his own small, dark cabin, nestled alone in the woods. It was a shelter, but it had never been a home. "No," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "I suppose I did not." He turned his gaze from the mountains to her face. She was watching him, her eyes full of a deep, gentle understanding that he felt all the way to his soul. "I was lost for a long time, Alara. I just did not know it until I found my way here." She smiled, a slow, warm smile that seemed to push away the last of the winter chill. She reached out and placed her hand on his. His skin was rough from work and weather, but her touch was a comfort he had not realized he was missing his entire life. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped together, saying nothing. The valley grew dark around them, but the cabin at their backs was filled with a steady, golden light. A man who had sought refuge in the silence of the mountains had found his home in the quiet heart of a family. The mountain had given him not solitude, but a reason to share the silence.